All right, we should be recording now. Welcome everyone to this Circe webinar on the classical order of learning and John Milton. This is going to be a good one. All right, so we'll share here. Don't peek ahead in the slides too much. Right from start. Here's the beautiful graphic that I'm guessing Graham put together. I always love these. I'm always excited whenever I sign up to do a webinar. I get to receive a nice piece of art from it. And so I always feel blessed by that. I've kind of thought about printing them off and, having posters of them or something like that, because they always look nice. So a quick overview on what we're going to be up to today. We are going to briefly cover my bio, not Milton's bio. We're going to introduce John Milton a little bit, although I did just read an article by Josh Gibbs that argued the point that we need to stop including authors' bios when we do presentations on them, let their work stand apart from their historical account. Yeah, interesting. Well, I read that after I put this together, so that's why that's there. Then we're going to get into the nitty-gritty, which is going to be the purpose of education according to Milton. We're going to look at a few excerpts of Paradise Lost. Then we're going to actually cover the order of learning as it's conveyed in Milton and some other places. Talk about that a little bit. Talk about the importance of metaphor as is related to the order of learning. And then a fun bit, Milton has, if you've read the essay, he has a very, what do you call it? I would say inflammatory perspective on what not to do if you'd like to be a good classical educator. And we'll talk about that a little bit. That's a good note. And I'm sure anyone that's done classical education for any length of time will find some resonance with it. And then we have the Latin agrarians, which will make more sense as we get into it. Milton describes and talks about why we should read the Latin agrarians. And so we're going to take a quick view of them, and then we'll have a Q&A. So a little bit about me. My name is Daniel Shirley. I grew up in what I guess I'm coming to understand is the classical renewal. This is a resurgence in the world of classical education, of which Circe has been a significant part. I've been privileged to grow up into it. I've been teaching for about 8 years now in a variety of different modalities, online, in person, with a variety of institutions, of which Circe is one. I'm married to my beautiful wife, Anne. We have been married for, I guess they're coming up on, what, 3.5 years? So that's been lovely. And then I would say, if I was going to describe myself and my relationship with classical education, I'd say that I'm growing into a fool for classical education with the help of Circe. I did the Circe online apprenticeship for a little while, and I was in college at the same time, actually, when I met my wife. And as I was doing the apprenticeship, growing up, being classically educated all the way through, made me think that maybe I knew something about classical education. And through the apprenticeship, which is where I was first introduced to this notion of the order of learning, I quickly recognized that there was a lot left to learn. And so since then, I've kind of re-embraced this notion or desire to be a student and continue to grow and develop regarding all things classical education. And so let's talk a little bit now. Oh, and then also, if you haven't seen the new Plays the Thing shirt, it's a wonderful t-shirt, comfortable, good material, looks nice under a jacket. So go pick one of those up and listen to the podcast while you're at it. This ends the sponsored portion of the video. All right, let's talk about John Milton a little bit. So John Milton lived from 1608 to 1674. He had a wide variety of writings. Some of you might be familiar with most of them or some of them. He writes on topics ranging from, the why we should educate to whether or not we should be allowed to get divorced, to poetry, to Paradise Lost is his most famous work that most people are at least somewhat familiar with in the classical education world. The epic of English poetry, although there is argument to whether or not it's truly considered an epic. We could talk about that a little bit later, or message me at some point later if you'd like to talk about it. His treatise on education was written in 1644. So right smack dab in the middle. Before I advance to this slide, I should also note that I don't know if Milton was considered the last person to have ever read everything. And by reading everything, I mean legitimately reading all of the meaningful texts to the tradition of Western classical education. So he read all of the Greeks, he read all of the Romans, he read all of the medievals up to his day, and was familiar with the commentary on basically everything that was going on in his time as well. And so it's hard for us as modern people to imagine that there was a time where a single person actually possessed the lifespan, not even just the attention, but the lifespan to be able to read everything that had ever been written. I think when I did a quick Google search, which is now AI powered, which is fun, I think it said something like Coleridge might have been the last one to ever read everything. And I think he was maybe 100, 150 years after Milton. And so just this aspect of maybe we should take this guy seriously, because unlike the dichotomized, separate disciplinary studies that inhabit the modern world today, you could actually have one individual that read everything that had ever been written. And all of those things were in his mind as he was constructing and writing about education. And so in the context of classical Christian education, we might ask a couple of questions. And so the first thing that we might ask would be, what's the most important thing for our students to know in a classical Christian context? If we had to state a vision or a goal for where we wanted our students to be at the end of a classical Christian education, what would it be? What would they want to know? So if you guys want to type in the chat at all and answer to that question, what's the most important thing for our students to know? So think about that. And then the follow-up question is, the most important thing that our students should know or need to know in a classical Christian education context, the same thing as the first that they should know? Is it the same thing as the first? And this fundamentally is a distinction between what we would term the orders of knowing versus learning. And so an order of knowing would hierarchically organize the importance of studies by what it is important to know. And then the order of learning obviously retools that hierarchy and orients it in the direction of learning. And so these things, while not opposed, they harmonize quite well and they echo in each other. But often we might find, upon closer examination of our own curriculum, our own pedagogy, our own studies, that we prioritize the knowing rather than the learning process. So we'll grasp for things that maybe are too far beyond us, that we haven't developed an ability to attain yet. And so, what is the purpose of education according to John Milton? Well, he conveniently gives us a introductory quote. This is essentially the first thing that he says in his essay or his letter. I'll read it. He says, "The end of learning, then, is to repair the ruins of our first parents by regaining to know God aright, and out of that knowledge to love him, to imitate him, to be like him, as we may the nearest by possessing our souls of true virtue, which being united to the heavenly grace of faith makes up the highest perfection." So Milton lays out the purpose of education here quite succinctly, and the statement that the end of learning then is to repair the ruins of our first parents. And so when I was reading this essay, the question came to me, well, what are the ruins of our first parents exactly? And where would I go to find maybe Milton's perspective on the ruins of our first parents. If you know Milton's works in his corpus, there's a very convenient place to go and explore this question and topic, and that is, of course, Paradise Lost. And so Paradise Lost, I'm sure everyone's going to be familiar with it, but if you're not, it is essentially a poem that chronicles the fall of humankind. So it's a retelling of the events of Genesis chapter 3, well, kind of 1, 2, and 3, in Milton's kind of epic imagination. And so one of the things that I like to point out often when I'm talking with people about modern beliefs about the way that the book of Genesis happens, there's so much of Milton ingrained in our tradition of interpreting the first 3 chapters of Genesis that we almost can't even see it with clean eyes anymore. They're inevitably stained by Paradise Lost, which is, you could argue, there are much worse perspectives to have than Paradise Lost, but it is important to kind of be able to recognize what's in the text, what's in the scripture, and what's actually kind of a Milton special, right? Oh, and I should also point out that I thought it was incredibly interesting that the hurricane that's coming through now is Milton. And so for that to land on the date of this webinar blew my mind a little bit. I was talking with my wife about that, and she was yeah, she was like, this is an interesting coincidence. And other than that, I don't really know what to make of it. So hopefully we can send good energies toward our fellow suffering people that are enduring this event, so many hurricanes so fast. But back to, what are the ruins of our first parents? And we have a couple of examples from Paradise Lost here. If you're familiar with the text, there's a lot, but I tried to distill it into a couple of examples. And so the first excerpt here is when Eve has been she's talking with the serpent. The serpent has approached Eve, and Eve is talking with the serpent, trying to figure out if she's going to listen to the serpent or not. And the serpent is demonstrating his rhetorical prowess, attempting to lure Eve to partake of the fruit. And so he talks about his own experience of partaking of the fruit himself, with a couple of things that we'll take note of as we read through. So I'll try to read this. Milton obviously spells a little bit differently than we do today. What thou commandest, and right thou shouldst be obeyed. I was at first as other beasts that graze the trodden herb of abject thoughts and low, as was my food. Nor aught but food discerned or sex, and apprehended nothing high. Till on a day roving the field, I chanced a goodly tree, far and distant to behold, loaden with fruit of fairest colors mixed. About the mossy trunk I wound me soon, for high from ground the branches would require thy utmost reach, or Adam's. Notice the reaching. Round the tree all other beasts that saw, with like desire, longing and envying stood, but could not reach. Amid the tree now got where plenty hung, tempting so nigh to pluck and eat my fill, I spared not. For such pleasure till that hour, at feed or fountain, never had I found. And he continues about the effects of eating the fruit. And he says, sated at length ere long I might perceive strange alteration in me, to degree of reason in my inward powers, and speech wanted not long, though to this shape retained. So he's saying that the fruit endowed him with these qualities. So he's pretending to be a serpent, right? We know that he possesses these qualities because he's not really a serpent. Thenceforth to speculations high or deep I turned my thoughts, and with capacious mind considered all things visible in heaven or earth or middle, all things fair and good. But all that fair and good in thy divine semblance, and in thy beauty's heavenly ray united I beheld, no fair to thine equivalent or second. So there's a element of he's subjecting himself to Eve here, complimenting her beauty, which compelled me thus though importune perhaps, to come and gaze and worship thee of right declared sovereign creatures, universal Dame. And so here we see the serpent describing the virtues of this fruit and the effects that the fruit had on the serpent, which we know is a lie, but the effects that it had on him when he partook of the fruit. And then he ends this speech by subjecting himself to Eve and kind of embodying this humility that really is not his end at all. It's a deception. And then here we have the serpent persuading Eve after Eve has responded and said, well, I'm not really sure that was a good speech, and you think I'm beautiful, but God said not to eat of the fruit. And then the serpent comes back with, he knows that in the day ye eat thereof, your eyes shall seem so clear, yet are but dim, and shall perfectly be then opened and cleared, and ye shall be as gods, knowing both good and evil as they know. That ye should be as gods, since I as man, internal man, but is but proportion meet, I of brute human. So he's associating himself with human nature as he received from eating the tree. Ye of human gods. So ye shall die perhaps by putting off human to put on gods, death to be wished, though threatened, which no worse than this can bring. And what are gods that man may not become as they, participating in godlike food? The gods are first, and that advantage use on our belief that from all them proceeds. I question it. For this fair earth I see warmed by the sun, producing every kind, them nothing. If they all things who enclosed knowledge of good and evil in this tree, that whoso eats thereof, forthwith attains wisdom without their leave. And so we have a really wonderful rhetorical flip here. He's questioning the something like the fecundity, the fruitfulness of God, and says that they claim that all things proceed from them. And he's saying, well, it doesn't seem to me to be that way. It seems like all things proceed from the earth. And so he's attempting to, let's say, invert an understanding. He's presenting an inverted understanding so that Eve will eat the fruit. And she does eat the fruit, right? And so in that episode, there's nothing more really to learn than has already been communicated in these excerpts, but I would recommend going to read it and kind of contemplating on the perspective that can be gained from reading Milton's perspective on the ruins of our first parents. And then this is also another interesting tidbit. She takes the fruit and she brings it to Adam, and Adam's horrified. He's, can't believe that Eve ate the fruit. And then Milton has the audacity to say that out of sheer love for Eve, Adam partook of the fruit. And I think we get an interesting dimension to Milton's perspective if we go and we read his thoughts on the way that marriage should work and the potential for divorce. I think he himself felt quite jaded by the women in his life. And so all things considered, I think he portrays Eve beautifully, but there's at least an aspect to that question. Reading through, I think it deserves to be talked about more. Do we think that that's a compelling argument to be made for why Adam partook of the fruit from Eve, is because he couldn't bear the thought of not living in paradise with Eve. And so from these excerpts, we can really derive and see a couple of things. An inversion of the order that God had presented to Adam and Eve, and the temptation to partake of that which had been set apart and away from them to partake. There's really an interesting perspective that we'll get into next. I believe that it's from, St. Ephraim the Syrian. And he comments on this passage to further kind of illuminate and interpret what's going on inside this text. And he has a very interesting perspective that's worth contemplating. He says, Satan, who was in the serpent, why he has his rational powers, it's not something that was endowed to him by the fruit. spoke through the serpent to the woman, did God really say that you should not eat of any of the trees of paradise? It is right that we should realize that had they been commanded not to eat of any of the trees, as the serpent said, it would have been a big commandment. Whereas in fact, they were commanded exactly the opposite, as it were, no commandment at all, seeing that it was so small and had been given only temporarily until the tempter had gone away from them. And so we get this hint here, which is made more explicit in the next quote. For had the serpent been rejected along with the sin, they would have eaten of the tree of life, and the tree of knowledge would not have been withheld from them any longer. From the one they would have inquired infallible knowledge, and from the other they would have received immortal life. They would have acquired divinity in humanity, and had they thus acquired infallible knowledge and immortal life, they would have done so in this body. And so this perspective on the original sin says something like the sin has an element of grasping something before you're ready to receive it. And so that was foundational to the act itself. It was a movement out of haste and impulsivity and arrogance that caused the ruins of our first parents. And so there's an analogy to be made here as well with the fairy tale of Snow White. There's several examples of this mythologically that we can identify and kind of play with. In the original Snow White fairy tale, we have the evil witch, right? Which is very much, there's parallels between the evil witch and Satan inside Milton's Paradise Lost. We get these monologues where they're contemplating what they're going to do to keep this new creation, something like that, from receiving glory. And so one of the things that they decide to do is to go and trick them, but they trick them in a particular way. And this is also important, and I think encouraging for us as educators. They trick them by insisting that they need something that they already have. They trick them by insisting that they need something that they already have. And so obviously, as Snow White is a later story, there's going to be more examples of this repeated over and over. And so in the original tale, Snow White is considered to be the most beautiful, right? And Adam and Eve are in the image of God. And the Lucifer can't stand that Adam and Eve are in the image of God, and the witch can't stand that Snow White is the most beautiful. And so in the Snow White tale, the witch actually comes 3 times and gives Snow White different gifts, all of which are supplement to her beauty, which, as we know and have been told already in the story, as with Genesis, it's something that they already have. But the witch decides to say, hey, I know, like, you are beautiful, but you know what? You'd be even more beautiful if you took this. So she gives her like a comb, and whoa, the comb is poisoned. So she takes the comb, believing the witch, puts it in her hair, and dies. And then is brought back by the dwarves, and then the witch comes back, right? You think there would be kind of alarm bells going off, strangers giving you gifts. The witch comes back and has a corset. Says, if you put this on, you'll be the most beautiful. And the corset strangles Snow White, and then she's brought back again. And then the final bit, and this one's we learn from the previous 2 examples the significance of the apple. And so then the witch comes back with the apple and says, if you eat this, then you will be the most beautiful. And so Snow White eats the apple, and in the story, the dwarves can't resuscitate her. And so the prince has to fulfill that role. But I just wanted to highlight a parallel here between the temptation of the serpent and another image that might further illuminate how we understand the temptation of the serpent. In some very real way, Adam and Eve already possessed the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It was going to be given to them at a future time. And they reached out and took from it before it was time to do it, in the belief that it was something that would add to what they already had. And so here is where we introduce the order of learning. And as Milton sees it, the order of learning is something like a remedy to the inappropriate grasping of the fruit on the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It repairs the ruins of our first parents. And so in the Circe apprenticeship, we talk about this concept a decent amount. We talk about these ideas and examples. And here we see an image of the order of learning, and I'll walk through it very, well, not very quickly, maybe a little bit quickly. We have piety on the bottom, piety, faithfulness. If there were roots coming off the bottom of the tree, it would be piety and faithfulness. Nothing can grow outside of that kind of virtue, which is something like obedience to parents, commitment to your studies, or commitment and discipline regarding exercise and diet, and commitment to the highest ideal, something like that. That there's the capacity for the soul to receive and actually admire and in consequence imitate. And then we have gymnastic and music that are right after that. And this is something that I'll spend a good bit of time talking about here in the next couple of slides, because I think that gymnastic and music are particularly potent elements of the order of learning for us to participate in as moderns. And then we move to the trivium, the study of the language arts, the quadrivium, the study of the created order of the world, and then natural philosophy, ethical philosophy, philosophy, and finally, theology. And so hopefully I haven't made it too cliche by showing an image of a tree here, but there's something like a inappropriate grasping that happens when we aim to become proficient in philosophy or teach philosophy to a student before they're grounded well in gymnastic, music, trivium, and quadrivium, and before maybe they possess the virtue of piety. And these are questions that are interesting to spend a good bit of time introspectively wrestling with. There's a metaphor of gymnastic. We need to be able to accurately assess where we are in our educational journey. But that's not to say that we can't find God in gymnastic, or we can't find God in the expression of piety. We very much can, right? There's an incarnational principle that governs the Christian world that is beautiful, and that kind of removes any kind of tyrannical element from this hierarchy here. It's like God is in all, Christ is in all. And so we find him as we move from these disciplines to other disciplines in the classroom, in our personal lives. And so even though we have it laid out like this, this is not tyrannical in its imposition. It's a roadmap, more or less. If you want to know where to go next, think about what's next on the hierarchy here, and then look for ways to participate in it. And it's all rooted in piety. Here's another illustration of the order of learning without the use of the tree image, if that's helpful. Gymnastic and music are on the same level. We'll talk about that for reasons, the reasons that they're on the same level. But a quick way to think about this is that we also start in education, we start concretely, right? So we'll start in the body, and that's where education happens first. So you might say, if you know the quadrivium, you might say, oh, well, harmonics is in the quadrivium. Why is there music here as well? And I think at least one aspect or element to that is that this music is more body. It's more have the students listen to and experience beautiful music rather than having them compose music or play an instrument, although those could be part and parcel of it. You'll see they're all connected. And so music, a study of music, a foundation of music will fruit into a love of and a pursuit of harmonics. And so the gymnastic in the same way, very much embodied. And then as we move kind of up the body, you know, you don't wrestle with your head most of the time. You wrestle with the other elements and aspects of your body. The trivium is all centered around language, right? And so you could almost map this onto the frame of a human person as well. And then obviously theology being something like a crown above the person. But as we climb rank orders in the hierarchy, we go from concrete and embodied to abstract and less embodied, all the way up to study of theology. And so let's talk about gymnastics. Now, this is something, as a student of classical education, I've wrestled with often. And I also think about this in regards to the students that I teach. This year I have 8th graders. I'm used to having 12th graders. I'm used to having, you know, children that are on their way out, or adults for all intents and purposes, into the world. And it's interesting, like how much more body my 8th graders are than my 12th graders. And that's not a universal, right? There's always exceptions to this kind of thing, but the form of instruction, the mode of instruction, the element that we're emphasizing in teaching along this hierarchy of the order of learning ought to match with the level of, let's say, the level of body that our students are at that point in time. And so it's been a real challenge to move from the kind of more intellective, more capable of abstract thinking 18-year-olds to, you know, 12, 13-year-olds that just want to run around all the time. Every time we break from kind of our gathering assembly, they sprint to the classroom, and then they sit down and they're eating food while we're, you know, doing it. And I love that. I like that students can have snacks in the classroom. But there's just something to acknowledge here. And so if we look at the classical tradition, we'll notice that there's 3 primary modes of gymnastic. There are others, but these are the 3 primary. We have wrestling, we have boxing, and we have running. And I would say inside the modern framework, we really emphasize, metaphorically, we emphasize the running. Running is the most like being a modern individual, a modern person. And precisely for that reason, that we are independent individual. There are team sports with running, but you're still all running on your own. It doesn't require that you have, I guess if you need somebody else to race against, but fundamentally, you know, if you're running, you're running. And it doesn't require another person to be there with you to run, although it can be helpful and nice. It's very much, you'll talk to anyone that runs, and you have this aspect or element of an internal battle with yourself and with your own will in order to achieve your goals, to overcome the part of your brain that tells you to stop and to move and run faster. And the more that you do that, the better you get at it. So I think about academics as connected to this metaphor of running in some real sense, because the virtue of doing research, or, you know, committing yourself to do an endurance read of a long book that you should have read a long time ago, and, you know, catching up and kind of keeping this pace and developing this fitness, it's in a large part an individual endeavor. And so we have that tenor, or that attitude, that resonance of running as gymnastic, I would say primarily dominates, whereas the boxing and the wrestling are much less emphasized. Now, there's a resurgence right now in the world of, you know, mixed martial arts. And I think that it, in some sense, bears relation to the cause of the modern vacuum of these things. And so the wrestling and the boxing both possess visceral experiences that can't help but shape the way that you view the immaterial and abstract realms of your life. And so if you've never wrestled before, if you've never engaged in boxing, then there's a sparring element to our dialogical relationship with one another that we don't viscerally have an experience of. And this was something essentially universal across classic authors. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But this experience of something that is not, let's say it's non-propositional, the move that you put on someone in a wrestling match is, let's say you train it in something that mirrors and simulates propositional learning. You have to learn the grips and the holds and then practice over and over again. But as you do it, you develop and build an intuition and a skill that you didn't possess previously, and also becomes something that's less propositional and more procedural. It's something that you're actually engaged in executing. And this is fundamental to the study of learning, and what education is aiming at foundationally is the training of our souls to love what is true, good, and beautiful. And we do this through training these skills, but we can't forget that we have a body that ingrains metaphors intuitively into us for our approaches and understandings to things higher up the ladder of learning. So for example, one common cause or issue that I feel like I hear, more or less regularly is that people can't have arguments well with each other, right? We have an argument and we immediately engage with it as hostile. And we go into fight or flight mode instead of recognizing or even having a paradigm for something like playful sparring, which can vary in levels of intensity, and you know it if you've experienced it, or wrestling, where you're not actually trying to, like, let's say, kill another person, but you're in a domain where you're physically exerting yourself against each other's energies, and whoever is better will win. And so this dynamic of engaging in disagreement hospitably, and knowing that there's actually a very important place for this inside our world, especially as it seems less and less likely that we're able to talk about important things without inflaming a relationship. These components of, let's say, dialogical gymnastic, where it's not just you doing an activity, but instead is a very visceral connection and relationship that you have with another animated human being. And so I would go as far to say that I don't believe that Plato would have been the philosopher he was, or able to portray Socrates in the way that he did, had he not also been the wrestler that he was. And so the components of gymnastic are incredibly important to keep in perspective as we strive to be classical educators. And so Milton comments on this saying, therefore, an hour and a half ere they eat at noon should be allowed to them for exercise, so 90 minutes. But the time for this may be enlarged at pleasure. They're having a good time. According as their rising in the morning shall be early, the exercise which I commend first, I don't know what to make of this, the exact use of their weapon to guard and strike safely with an edge or point. This will keep them healthy, nimble, strong, and well in breath. Good VO2 max. It is also the likeliest means to make them grow large and tall, and to inspire them with gallant and fearless courage, which being tempered with seasonable lectures and precepts, to them of true fortitude and patience will turn into a native and heroic valor, and make them hate the cowardice of doing wrong. They must also be practiced in all the locks and gripes of wrestling. All the locks and gripes of wrestling, wherein Englishmen were wont to excel. Okay, a little nationalism here. As need may often be in fight to tug or grapple and to close, we would say submit, and this perhaps will be enough wherein to prove and heap their single strength. And so you'll notice inside this paradigm, we're also dealing primarily with a masculine education. I think I was talking with my little sister about this, I want to say a couple of nights ago, and she was like, well, what about gymnastic for women? And as far as a means to get into wrestling in the modern world, it seems like there are some schools that have wrestling programs. It's hard to find wrestling clubs as an adult outside of, a handful of places. They're not as popular, but Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is having a massive spike at the moment in popularity. I think it's like the 5th or 6th fastest growing sport right now. So I would highly recommend. That's friendly for boys and girls and for men and women. There's continuing to be an increasing presence of female jiu-jitsu players and practitioners. and it's really lovely. But really, in this case, if you're going to prioritize something like a martial art, which boxing and wrestling are inevitably one, pick one that is oriented toward sparring. You have to have a sparring element in order for the visceral experience of the practice to actually be meaningful. There's a lot of practices that teach forms and, katas and all this kind of stuff. That's beautiful, and I think there's a place for that. But I think it's important to recognize that that is more akin to the nature of something like running, where you're training your body, it's an introspective you're dealing with yourself primarily as your own opponent instead of having a physically manifest opponent in the form of another human being. Very valuable. And so here is where a key to the order of learning emerges. I would term this key, it's probably not my word. I'm sure that it was taught to me and I just internalized it and conveniently forgot who said it. I would say metaphorical necessity. So what is metaphorical necessity? Metaphorical necessity is the relationship that everything on the order of learning has with the things underneath it. And so we can jump back real quick to our tree here. Piety is a metaphorical necessity for gymnastic and music. Gymnastic and music are a metaphorical necessity for engagement with language. Language is a metaphorical necessity for the engagement with arithmetic, geometry, harmony, and astronomy. Those studies are a metaphorical necessity for natural philosophy. You could almost even say a literal necessity. And then natural philosophy is a metaphorical necessity for ethical philosophy. You need to consider the causes and effects as they take place without the complication of persons, which is the subject of ethical philosophy. Consider causes and effects in the natural world before you consider them in people. You're more likely to err in your judgment of people if you haven't spent time in the world of cause and effect, uninhabited by all the interesting things that we get up to as people. Then the study of ethical philosophy, the cause and effect as is related to the human person and in the human soul. Philosophy, the study of cause and effect as such. So we now move from having them embodied in first cause and effect is embodied in the natural world. We study it there, we gain metaphorical language, we gain intuitive understanding. We grow to consider the relationship of cause and effect in the human person. We grow in understanding. We move to a place where we seek to shed some of the temporal. So we shed the body, we shed the natural world, and we contemplate cause and effect as such. And then we have theology, which would be something like the contemplation of the first cause, or the most important thing to know. And so why do we need to be aware of metaphorical necessity? Why is metaphorical necessity important and appropriate? Well, it wasn't written about explicitly inside the classical texts. It's mentioned and you can intuit it and understand it, but it wasn't written about explicitly. And it wasn't written about explicitly because this was so obvious. Everyone knew this. If you wanted to ever be a great politician, a great leader, a great king, you had to first be a great person. These are not controversial topics, but often we decide to skip some rungs, or we inevitably leave out rungs on the order of learning, and we grasp something before we're ready. Patty said just a little while back, what about fencing? Yeah, I think fencing definitely could be a way. I just think that let's say that in Milton's era, there was still swords were still a viable military weapon, maybe. And then I don't know what I think about the practice of military strategy in the world today. I feel like we've inadvertently turned everyone into archers. And I don't know if that has the same kind of kick to it. But if you could fence, then it probably wouldn't be a bad idea.
Thanks.
Yeah. So metaphorical necessity is not written about explicitly. And so as we climb without scaffolding, this is, let's say, essentially the claim of this webinar, we imitate our first parents. And we grasp that, which we think that we need, that we kind of already have, but we do it out of order. And this is something to be avoided, because if we don't avoid it, we might inadvertently bring all sorts of curses on ourselves while we think we're doing something good. And I get that there's an aspect of that or an element of that that could seem scrupulous, but I do think that always approaching the next rung on the ladder with respect, with piety, with hesitation, with humility, with patience is an incredible virtue, and it's very easy to say, very difficult to practice. The elements of accidentally cursing ourselves, I feel like, yeah, we could talk about that for a while, but I don't want to get too sidetracked. So the relationship that exists between the elements of the order of learning are metaphorical. They give us intuitions. They increase from body to abstraction. So what does Milton say about this notion of metaphorical necessity? How can we kind of tease it out? There are a couple of places inside his essay that he hints at this. And here is where we get into his do not do this if you're going to be a classical educator. So remember, we're talking about metaphorical necessity here, and we're looking for confirmation of it in Milton. We say, first, we do amiss to spend 7 or 8 years merely in scraping together so much miserable Latin and Greek as might be learned otherwise easily and delightfully in 1 year, forcing the empty wits of children to compose themes, verses, and orations, which are in fact acts of the ripest judgment and the final work of a head filled by long reading and observing. And so it's a jumping into the abstraction before we're ready for it. What is it? Dante says something about, woe is the fisherman who goes to fish for truth and doesn't have the tools to fish. This is when we plunge accidentally ourselves or our students into the depths of metaphysic, and we don't have the tools that we brought up with us to engage with those waters well. And so we find them distasteful and possibly drown. So here we also have Milton commenting on this. He says, I deem it to be an old error of universities not yet well recovered from the scholastic grossness of barbarous ages, that instead of beginning with arts most easy, and those be such as are most obvious to the sense, the most embodied, they present their young and unmatriculated novices at first coming with the most intellective abstractions of logic and metaphysics, so that they, having but newly left those grammatic flats and shallows, where they stuck unreasonably to learn a few words with lamentable construction, and now on the sudden transported under another climate to be tossed and turmoiled with their unballasted wits in fathomless and unquiet depths of controversy. Whew, all right, it's not done yet. Do for the most part grow into a hatred and contempt of learning, mocked and deluded all this while with ragged notions and babblements, while they expected worthy and delightful knowledge, till poverty or youthful years call them importunely their several ways, and hasten them with the sway of friends, either to an ambitious or mercenary or ignorantly zealous divinity. Right? So here we even have an invocation of the divine, which would be, right, as the study of theology is at the top of the order of learning, a inappropriate grasping or a inappropriate union with zealous divinity or with a divinity. Some allured to the trade of law, grounding their purposes not on the prudent and heavenly contemplation of justice and equity, which was never taught them because they jumped, but on the promising and pleasing thoughts of litigious terms, fat contentions, and flowing fees. Others betake them to state affairs with souls so unprincipled in virtue and true generous breeding that flattery and court shifts and tyrannous aphorisms appear to them the highest points of wisdom, instilling their barren hearts with a conscientious slavery, if, as I rather think, it be not feigned. So that's fairly bleak. But we have essentially the dual outcome of presenting our unmatriculated novices with the most intellective abstractions. The consequence is they either think that the highest wisdom is something that it is not, or they don't think that anything is meaningful at all. If it not be feigned, it's all fake. Just here to gather a profit. And so let's look at how Milton lays out his order of learning in his essay on education. So we have 8 points that I pulled out. Really, the whole essay is not very long, and I would highly encourage reading it if you haven't. But the first thing that we should do is begin with the chief and necessary rules of some good grammar. Now, what does grammar mean? In Milton's definition of grammar, what he's really talking about is learning how to speak. Not even a different language, although he does get into when your students should be studying Italian and German and Greek and Latin. And by the time you ended Milton's educational program, you would probably know like 17 languages. This is not that. We begin with grammar, learning how to speak. So think about this in relationship to trivium. So we're starting out inside a trivium space. And we'll have callbacks to some of the other virtues or other elements of the order of learning as well. But we begin here with something in the trivium. This assumes the presence of piety. It assumes the presence and participation in music and gymnastic. And so if knowing music and gymnastic, we should both know how to harmonize with someone using our speech, how for our speech to sound harmonious, and also for the ability or the what is it? The potential for grappling verbally with others. These are the trainings that are going on first. Next, to make them expert in the usefulest points of grammar. So honing that skill, and withal to season them and win them early to the love of virtue and true labor, ere any flattering seducement or vain principle sees them wandering. Some easy and delightful book of education would be read to them rather than them reading, whereof the Greeks have in store, as Cebes, Plutarch, and other Socratic discourses. And so Milton's essay here is also a very rich trove of resources to gather and read and develop. I found some great delight in reading some of the things that he suggested that I had never touched before and would be kind of ashamed to say hadn't heard about before. And so we have here develop and season them in grammar, but also win them early to the love of virtue and true labor. This is a pious state of being. Have them commit themselves to virtue and labor through love. Ere any flattering seducement or vain principle seize them. And so a principle, right, from the Latin principio is a first thing. And so we want them to unite themselves to the right first thing, love of virtue. But here, the main skill and groundwork will be to temper them, such lectures and explanations upon every opportunity, as may lead and draw them in willing obedience, inflamed with the study of learning and the admiration of virtue, stirred up with high hopes of living to be brave men and worthy patriots, dear to God and famous to all ages. And this would be something like a pious capstone, right? So he casts an in vision here of what the pious man looks like. And so one of the elements or studies that could be worthwhile is to engage with the lives of pious men so that we can learn from and imitate their examples of piety and read those stories to our students and to our children. At the same time, some other hour of the day might be taught to them the rules of arithmetic, and soon after, the elements of geometry, even playing, as the old manner was. So the quadrivium is learned in play. I feel like there's an element of quadrivium education that could very well happen if you let loose a group of boys to go build a fort in the woods. There's going to be elements of at least arithmetic and geometry there. And so let them learn those things in play and instruct them when necessary. But I think something that's worth mentioning is not to dampen the flame of the soul toward the study of learning and the admiration of virtue. This might be one of the most important things that we can learn from this. Even after evening repast, till bedtime, their thoughts would be taken up with the easy grounds of religion and in the story of Scripture. And so it is important to understand that this is not theology per se, but it is, let's say, a more embodied form. And so it's an engagement with the story of it, not hypothesizing, interpreting, but reading the story and taking delight in the story. The next step would be the authors of agriculture, Cato, Varro, and Columella. For the matter is most easy, and if the language be difficult, so much the better. It's not the difficulty above their years, and here will be an occasion of inciting and enabling them hereafter to improve the tillage of their country, to recover the bad soil, and to remedy the waste that is made of good. Here's where I stop because I haven't read the Agrarians. So we'll talk about that a little bit because I had quite a good time coming across the Agrarians and reading them and thinking, if Milton's all about the inflammation of the soul, which we think inflammation generally is a bad thing, but the inflammation of the soul toward the love of virtue and the admiration of learning, how could a textbook on farming inflame in my soul love for virtue? So we'll come back to that. So that it will be seasonable for them to learn in any modern author the use of globes and all the maps, first with the old names and then with the new. They might be then capable to read in the compendious method of natural philosophy. And so we move in transition from something like the study of grammar, something like the study of the trivium and the quadrivium, something like the beginning of Latin studies, by reading the Agrarians, which transitions us into the space of natural philosophy. And so while the sharpening of the skills of grammar are being developed through the reading of these Latin authors, it says, don't be worried if the text is too difficult. It's not a difficulty above their years. They'll be able to read it. And if they are glimpsing things in it, the desire to read it will be greater. If they're glimpsing the life of the virtuous Roman farmer through the bits that they can understand from the Latin, it draws out in the student something that will commit themselves to uncovering more of that hidden treasure. And so that's what we're after. That's what we're after. And we're transitioning into natural philosophy. The study of a farm is very much tied up in the domain of cause and effect in the natural world. Like, how do you take care of a cow? Well, Varro talks to us about taking care of a cow. And so we can learn about what that means. And then he also comments on the nature of wealth and saying that, well, it's no wonder that cows are the marker of wealth in the land of Rome. He says that the term Latin pecunia is connected to the term for cow, which is pecus. And Milton would probably have a lot to say about my pronunciation of Latin. He has a passage in the essay where he says that we English have such lamentable pronunciation, essentially, because the north wind is too cold and we don't open our mouths wide enough when we're talking. We ought to try to imitate the phonetic patterns of Southern Italians. So he had a preference for the dialect of Southern Italy. I guess they opened their mouths more. So there's a fun little tidbit. By this time, years and good general precepts will have furnished them more distinctly with that act of reason, which in ethics is called, I can't pronounce that, and that they may with some judgment contemplate upon moral good and evil. And here is where we arrive in cycle to what the first parents, what Adam and Eve were trying to acquire prematurely. The discernment, the knowledge of what was good and what was evil. And so without the scaffolding, without the things that lead us up to this point, we imitate and we grasp immediately for what is good and what is evil without learning, without taking the time and the patience, regardless of where we are age-wise as students. So this is one of the things in Milton's ideal construction. This education starts when a student is 12 and will end in somewhere around the age of 21. So you can think about it roughly from like middle school into what we would term something like finishing undergraduate education as being the age range and frame in which these things take place. And so it doesn't begin earlier than that. It doesn't begin when the student is 4. Right? We're not going immediately into these studies when the students are in what's considered in our terms school age. They're almost inside this, they're almost in this space of like their rationality has started to really kind of rear its head, right? And so this is the space in which the education begins. It doesn't begin before it. And it ends inside the domain of ethical philosophy. Obviously, in Milton's paradigm, all of these things are in the service of regaining to know God aright. And so each of them, as they're participated in well, will show us an aspect in a what is it? Think about something like the canon of the Book of Nature. And Milton ends his essay saying, "Only I believe that this is not a bow for every man to shoot that counts himself a teacher, but will require sinews almost equal to those which Homer gave Ulysses. Yet I am withal persuaded that it may prove much more easy in the essay than it now seems at a distance, and much more illustrious, howbeit not more difficult than I imagine. And that imagination presents me with nothing but very happy and very possible, according to the best wishes, if God have so decreed, and this age have the spirit and capacity enough to apprehend." And so this is not something to be attempted by every teacher, but again, knowing what Milton is after, I don't know. I kind of read that as a challenge. And so by reading it as a challenge, I wonder if he puts it this way to have this kind of persuasive component. Like, oh, if I can educate, if I can equip myself in this education, if I can equip others, my students in this education, I'll be like Odysseus stringing his bow to prove that he is king. So anyway, a little interesting tidbit. Now, let's think about if the main issue that Milton had with classical education in his day, the scholastic grossness of the barbarous ages, was the miserable teaching of Latin and Greek, or the teaching of so much miserable Latin and Greek over a period of 8 years, right? Which is like the majority of the time that a student would spend inside Milton's educational system, pursuing the order of learning in this way. What would good Latin look like? And so he suggests, obviously, reading the agrarians. And so I decided to go and pick some of the agrarian passages to demonstrate how wonderful these texts are. All right, so this is from Cato, his introduction to On Agriculture. And he introduces it by saying, "The pursuits of commerce would be as admirable as they are profitable if it were not subject to so great risks, and so likewise of banking, if it was always honestly conducted. For our ancestors considered and so ordained in their laws that while the thief should be cast in double damages, the usurer should make fourfold restitution. And from this we may judge how much less desirable a citizen they esteemed the banker than the thief. When they sought to commend an honest man, they termed him a good husbandman and good farmer. This they rated the superlative of praise. Personally, I think highly of a man actively and diligently engaged in commerce who seeks thereby to make his fortune. Yet, as I have said, his career is full of risks and pitfalls. But it is from the tillers of the soil that spring the best citizens, the staunchest soldiers, and theirs are the enduring rewards, which are most grateful and the least envied. Such as devote themselves to that pursuit are least of all men to be given to evil counsels. And so even inside this domain of Latin, and if this text is used for the study of Latin and we're engaged in this with our students to read and learn Latin, we're uncovering this message of, well, what does farming have to say about the noble soul? What does farming have to say about the noble soul? How does the understanding of this Latin, but then also the practices that are in this text, bring forth the best of all citizens? And then there is this great proverb, know that as with a farm as with a man. So we have an analogy. However productive it may be, if it has, they call it the spending habit, not much will be left over. So regardless of how abundant the land is, if it has the spending habit, not much will be left over. You could spend an entire seminar talking about this quote with students. And then this is Varro. Those great men, our ancestors, did well to esteem the Romans who lived in the country above those who dwelt in town. For as our peasants today condemn the tenant of a villa as an idler in comparison with the busy life of an agricultural laborer, so our ancestors regarded the sedentary occupations of the town as waste of time from their habitual rural pursuits. And in consequence, they so divided their time that they might have to devote only one day of their week to the affairs in town, reserving the remaining 7 for country life. Again, we have an element of what does it look like to be the best human being, right? Which is, what is the ideal of human being? What does it look like for man to live the good life as a prominent classical question? And we have these surprising answers to these questions that emerge inside a Latin text on farming. And so it's things like this, especially in the hearts and minds of young men, that inflame the love of virtue and the admiration of learning. Because as you learn, you're gaining to yourself tools, tricks, trades. You know the answers to the riddles. You put them into practice. You come back because they didn't work, and you engage in this process of developing and growing. And it's driven by this desire. This desire. You've seen something beautiful, and you're moving you're moving toward it. It's drawing you into this world of learning. And so, in summary, to conclude, we have, according to Milton, education aims to repair the ruins of our first parents. The ruins of our first parents were, at least in part, I have a hard time claiming anything ultimate about that first story in Genesis, because I think there's more layers. I know that there are more layers than I'll ever be able to understand. The ruins of our first parents were, at least in part, grasping for knowledge forbidden to them. More so, the knowledge would have been given to them if they had been humble and patient. The order of learning, as we're taught in the Circe Apprenticeship and as affirmed by Milton, offers a way for us to repair these ruins of our first parents. And each rung on the order of learning complements the fact that we are embodied humans learning by metaphor and analogy. So we all start with, let's say, we could say, I don't want to get in trouble, less mind and more body. And as we become older, as we grow, we gain more mind, and we can be apt to forget the body, right? There's a reason that the primary heresies in the early church, right, are Gnostic. It's like there's this temptation to climb too fast, to become spirits, and to deny our human nature. And so the order of learning encourages us to do exactly the opposite, and to abide with the bodies and grow in them so that they can reach their branches up into the higher things and receive nourishment from them. But we need that foundation. And so we shouldn't forget our bodies. All right. That is all that I have to present today. So I feel like I talked a lot. My AI meeting coach is going to tell me that my longest talking spiel was way too long. So we can do some questions and answers now if you guys have any.
I don't know that I have any questions. Just taking it all in. That's great.
Cool beans. Well, thanks for hopping on, Patty.
Yeah.
All right. And then was it Lene? Do you have any questions, any thoughts that sprung into your mind as we were moving through Milton's education essay? Excellent. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap this up. So that will be good. Thank you guys for tuning in. I hope everyone that watches the recording will have a good time. Feel free to reach out on social media if you want to talk about anything. I'll be around.
Thanks, Daniel.